have, folks. It's Wednesday, March 31st, and this is the Agricultural Committee, Senate Ag Committee, and we're going to be talking in regards to the Universal Meals Program, and probably spending the rest of the morning dealing with that subject matter. We have some guests with us, Faye Mack and Rosie Kruger from the AOE, and Jim Demiraz, is it, from our Legislative Council. And so to get everybody up to speed, yesterday, I think the committee asked if I would speak with Jane and maybe Becca and so anyways, I did have an opportunity to talk with Senator Kitchell, and she suggested that we might want to look at as a qualifier, because she doesn't believe that we in the state should be paying for meals for people with high incomes. And I think we've heard that from a few others. So she suggested that we look at the Dr. Dinosaur program, their qualifications and limits, and try to devise a system that would be handled with those same guidelines in effect, to that would bump out the top wage earners, but it would take in all different sized families, and up to I think their schedule runs up to a household size of eight children, or 8 in the household, and it caps out at $133,000. Linda tried to get someone from the health department to come and speak with us this morning in regards to if they're already doing this, they've got to know the number of participants in each of these household size categories. So it would give us a number where we could figure free and reduced meals go to a certain limit now in our school system, and how many new children that are out there that are utilizing Dr. Dinosaur would get picked up. And so that's where we are. Chris?
I want to hear from Faye and Rosie, but just a couple points of information. I did email Nolan, who is at JFO, who works on healthcare. He gave me the basic enrollment numbers. They don't have a way of backing out the 0 to 5-year-olds, but we would still get some sense of the universe. But I think I want to hear from Rosie in particular, because as soon as we move away from making it universal, I think we lose the ability to draw down federal dollars. And I'll just remind everybody that the $25 million investment brings in an additional $10 million in federal money, because the feds are kind of eager to have, or they are willing to promote the concept of universal meals. So, so many moving parts, but I just want to flag that and express that as a concern.
So from what you just said, does that leave a net cost to the to the state, 15 million?
Well, I don't
Right.
know, but I know that even when you're, the tier 2 eligibility or whatever it's called, when you go to universal meals, when any school goes to universal meals, federal money comes into play, even if you're a better, well-to-do school. And so that would not be invoked here, because we're not talking about universal meals. We're talking about subsidizing more Vermonters' meals under this Dr. Dinosaur scheme. So maybe we should turn it over to our experts, but I think we have to have our eyes wide open that once we move away from that, we I think reduce our ability to draw down federal dollars.
Yeah, I thought yesterday, Rosie or someone said that these numbers, like the base numbers of 24 to 40 million, was already figuring in the additional dollars that we were going to get from the feds. But we can go to Rosie and or Faye and get that squared away.
And Mr. Chair, Brianna is from JFO. She's on the call as well. And but no, the $25 million is the state dollars. It does not account for additional federal dollars.
Okay. So who wants to jump in on that issue? Faye?
I'd love for Rosie to go first, and then I'd love to follow up after that.
oh, Rosie.
If that's okay with Rosie.
Sure.
You got the monkey on your back.
So I want for the record, Rosie Kruger, State Director of Child Nutrition Programs at the Agency of Education. I want to start by saying, I think we have in the past already explored this idea of creating an additional tier of income eligibility, and that is far more complicated administratively on the school level and at the state level than a universal meals model or than what we were talking about yesterday, which was just going to universal meals for breakfast. It basically means we have to come up with our own state set of forms, and the schools have to go through additional training to figure out how to process that category. And then we have to modify our systems to create an additional category. It means that our numbers right now, free and reduced eligible means 185% of federal poverty or lower based on household size. And that's something that's, a national definition. And so we'd be asking our schools to start having that definition and then having this additional Vermont number on top. I can imagine a lot of confusion, a lot of additional training needed, a lot of confusion from families about when they see national information about eligibility and then the state information about eligibility. That makes me very anxious about having to try and implement an additional tier. And I would really urge you to think about other ways of of kind of phasing this in, or even just providing additional money on a per meal basis. We've talked before about how you could increase the pot of state match funds that schools get. Those funds are paid out based on the total number of meals served. So it would be additional revenue on a per plate basis for every single meal served. So you'd get some of those incentives that Scott was talking about yesterday, even if you didn't get to the full additional cost that schools would be incurring for paying for paid meals. And then the schools could decide, does this additional money make it feasible for us to move to a universal meals model? So there's several other ways of kind of getting halfway there that I would urge you to do, rather than thinking about trying to create an additional income tier for this kind of middle group of students. It's just administratively very complicated, not something that I could implement next year. We would need several years to implement that. And I think you don't get some of the advantages you're looking for that you would with some of the other ideas that we've talked about. And then I do need to correct Senator Pearson a little bit. There's not additional federal money specifically for going to universal meals other than through the community eligibility provision, which everybody who can do the community eligibility provision is already doing it. What I think you might be thinking about is that the feds do subsidize every paid meal. They pay 40 cents per meal for every paid meal. And they also pay for about 34 cents worth of USDA foods for every meal, including all the paid meals. So there is some additional federal revenue that you get when you serve more paid meals. But the numbers that JFO has come up with already include that as, offsetting. So there is additional federal funding coming in that, you're right, does go into the Vermont economy, but it doesn't offset the amount of local or state funds that are needed to pay for these meals.
So, Rosie, if I could just jump in on that. So when you hit, you don't need to go to a universal standard to unlock some of that. Is that what you're saying? It's just, it's already happening on every meal that's being served. So you get more because you're serving more meals, but you don't cross some line.
Exactly. So today, if a student who does not qualify for free and reduced meals eats, they're considered a paid student. Their family pays for that meal. But in addition to the family's payment, the feds pay 40 cents per lunch and 30 cents per breakfast, and then about 34 cents worth of USDA foods.
Okay. And Brianna, the estimate of 25 million to do this, that is the state dollars, right? I mean, we don't expect part of that 25 to be picked up by the feds, but we do understand that it will also mean federal dollars are added to that, correct?
Yes, Brianna Parker from the Joint Fiscal Office for the record, and that is absolutely correct. When I ran that calculation for the 24 to 40 million, I was including all of the federal aid we would get on the per meal basis and then using that as the way to get to the estimate. So that bulk would end up falling on to the state of Vermont in funding that program. Yes.
So, so the federal money is already included in the 25 million or 24 that it could cost us to move forward. And the 24 is based on if all children signed up for universal meals. It isn't like if only 80% signed up. What percentage did you use on signups to get to that number?
That's a great question. So the low end, the 24 million, that is based off of a participation rate. So the number of students eating the meals being 60% for breakfast and 75% for lunch. And this is based off of data that we've seen from other schools with universal meal programs, rounded up a little bit just to give us a little bit more of a buffer there. And that estimate also assumes the current number of students that are on the free and reduced price meals, because that's also a significant portion of federal funding that we receive and also state funding that's already in place. So those are the two main variables that go into making that $24 million estimate.
Yeah. And Rosie, if the general fund put some money in to say cover universal meals, what is the difference between if we in the legislature decide that we're going to put these other families in, but we're paying for the meals? How does that throw your calculations off as paid meals over at the agency? I mean, I don't understand, I guess, or can't follow why it would be a nightmare if we decided to put another 10,000 students on free lunch and pay for it?
So it has to do with how we count and claim the meals. So right now, all the schools have, a counting and claiming system. A lot of these are actually electronic systems that they buy off the shelf from vendors that are available nationwide and set up according to the national program. So you have categories of free students and reduced price students and then paid students. And those, as the child goes through the line, they enter either their PIN number, or the food service staff person records their name, and the system knows who's free, reduced, and paid, and tallies those categories. And then the school submits those categories to the state in our system, which is already structured with those 3 categories. And then we submit them up to USDA. So you're talking about adding a 4th category there. So not only at the beginning of the year, when the schools figure out all the application processing, they now have to have an additional category. So they need additional training on how to do that. They need a new application system to do that. A lot of them have already invested in these electronic application systems so that families can apply online. Those systems are systems that are provided nationally. And so those systems would need a lot of customization for a Vermont only category. So there would need to be a whole change there. And then when those students go through the line, you'd have to have this free, reduced, paid, and Vermont reduced category, or Vermont free category. So you'd now have 4 categories. Those would have to get rolled into the claim. Again, lots of modifications needed to these kind of off-the-shelf systems that are available nationally. And then that would have to go into the state system, which would need a lot of modifications. So it would be very administratively complex for all those reasons. And then I think Faye might speak to the fact that I'm not sure that you would see some of the benefits that folks would hope to get out of universal meals by going to that. So more complicated with less benefit, I think would be why I would urge you not to go in that direction.
So if you ran those students through as paid, then you have to know if the parents paid it, if some organization in the community paid it, if the feds paid it, or if the state paid it. You have to know who paid it, right? If it's under the paid category.
That paid category is any child who doesn't qualify for free and reduced meals. And so if you're talking about the state paying for some of those kids, but not other kids, then we'd need a tracking system for figuring out who qualifies for the state level. And then, so that need to really be divided into 2 categories. It's just really not a, I think we've seen other states think about doing this, and nobody else has done it because of that additional complication.
I think of it this way: either you have a cash register or you don't. And as soon as you're not in universal, you have a cash register, and you have to think about who is in the line and what, basically at some level, what is their income. And right, I mean, so as soon as you say we're not universal, then you're into thinking about how each kid is paying, and that blows all the efficiency out the window. We heard, that this was the guy from Essex yesterday saying, because we're universal, we totally revamped our system, and you're seeing the benefits. Anyway, other folks want to add points.
Yeah, Rosie, you had your hand up. Or Faye?
Sure, thank you. So for the record, Faye Mack from Hunger Free Vermont. I just wanted to add two thoughts into this conversation on top of what Rosie has said. One is that, and she alluded to this, but we know that until the cash register goes away, as Senator Pearson was just describing, there will be children, no matter what level we determine, the state will cover what income level. If it's mirrored Dr. Dinosaur, if it's as it is at the federal level, there will always be children who fall into the category that are eligible for free meals who will not eat the free meals because of the stigma that remains as long as there are some children whose families are paying. It's sort of, that's the the universality of universal school meals is where we see the stigma go away, and children who are going hungry and are skipping meals because of stigma start to eat, and where we start to see the educational benefits of universal school meals. So I want to underscore what Rosie was saying, that a lot of what I think the legislature has expressed interest in about universal school meals won't necessarily come if you all move forward with this idea of covering for 300% of poverty or the Dr. Dinosaur children. The other thing I want to just mention too is that if the state is covering the cost of meals for children, if in this structure that's being considered, if the cost is borne, by the state in some way, either through the education fund or through the general fund, but not by individual school districts, I think you'll also start to see all of the schools who already provide universal school meals switch over and stop providing universal school meals, because it will be more cost effective for them to go get the funding for those meals from the state. Right now, they've invested their school budget into the program, and I really worry that they'll switch. And so we'll see the 25% of schools who are providing universal school meals stop providing universal school meals, and we'll go backwards in terms of food access for children. I wanted to add those two pieces. I think also what Rosie is sharing around the complexity of essentially creating a new program within the school meal program is really complicated and confusing and costly for the state, for schools, for parents, and also will create more confusion as the federal government continues to make the moves they're indicating that they are interested in making toward expanding access to universal school meals and making universal school meals more affordable for schools to offer. It creates this new layer of complexity that I think will hold Vermont back in terms of actually expanding access.
Well, I'd say we have major problems moving forward. I don't know, if we can convince our colleagues that it just seems to me that we only have one choice here. I mean, I don't understand that, I guess. I beat around the legislature for quite a while, and I've always figured there was more than one way to skin a cat, you might say. And here we're trying to feed our children, and the only way we can do it is through this one universal meals program, which if it was set up in that fashion, it was poorly set up from the beginning. Maybe it's worked its way through the years and has worked to the point where it's gotten so complicated we can't get away from it, or you either sign up for it or you stay the way you are. And it's kind of bad if you had an extra $10 million or 15, you couldn't take that money and use it to feed children and not get penalized from one way or from the other way. It sounds to me like we'd get the schools that are already in universal meals that would want to quit and take up the new system. And I don't know where to go with it. Brian?
Yeah. I don't think there's any doubt that the bill as it is currently fashioned won't pass muster in our chamber. I get a feeling from, and I think everybody has to sort of understand that right now, that bill is not going to gain enough traction to get out. So then the question is, okay, if the idea is still something we want to do, how do we accomplish it? And it seems like Chris has come up with one solution, Bobby's come up with another solution. I came up with one yesterday, but it really isn't a solution because all it does is take the responsibility for the funding off the school districts, but it doesn't solve the problem. So I don't know where to go. It seems like every time we think we might have a possible solution, there's another thorny bush standing in the way that we got to walk through, and it isn't getting any easier here. So I don't know what to do. And in the meantime, of course, the bill's up for consideration on the floor tomorrow.
Yeah, Chris?
Well, we got a long way to go before tomorrow in the legislature. We can pull miracles off, but we have Brianna and Rosie both have their hands up, Mr. Chair.
Well, why don't we go to Rosie and then we'll switch to Brianna.
Okay, I was going to provide you with a couple of options that I think you could consider, but I think Brianna had her hand up first. I don't know.
Oh, well, maybe she already has the option for us, Brianna.
Thank you. I did just want to provide a financial estimate for the Dr. Dinosaur program option. I did work with some folks at JFO to come up with an estimate of about how many students we could reach through this program, and then ran a cost estimate on that. So if you're interested in getting a sense of what that might cost, I'm happy to provide that for you.
Yeah, sure. May as well hear what your work has produced.
Sure. So I factored in the amount of students that are currently through the Medicaid program, and we estimated that this would reach an additional 16,400 students, and would result in a cost range of about $10 to $14 million, depending on how many students chose to participate in that. So on the low end, we use that same kind of average participation rate that we've seen of 60% for breakfast and 75% for lunch. And then the high end being assuming all the students in attendance were to participate. And one of the other kind of variables that we were thinking about at JFO, which I would love to hear Rosie and Faye's perspective on this, but we were thinking that if families still need to provide their income or proof that they are within this kind of bracket, it might actually help with attaining some of those free and reduced price funding sources, and can just see our enrollment in those programs to be about the average of 40%, which does significantly help the total cost of the program because we continue to get that federal money. And so that's one of the kind of key differences in this analysis that I ran was I maintained that 40% in the free and reduced price meals because you continue to have that incentive to prove your income and maintain that eligibility in the federal programs.
Yeah, Brianna, the Medicaid children, I would expect they already get for reduced meals. And so why would you use that category to work up some numbers?
So I did include that in my calculation. And so the free and reduce is 185% of the federal poverty line and below can all qualify for that. And then the Medicaid goes all the way up to 317% of the federal poverty line. So those additional students would qualify. And so if we factor that in, it comes to about 16,400 students that would be in addition to what we currently offer.
Well, that, and Rosie, is that a big increase in students if we picked up an extra 16,500 students? Wouldn't that cover quite a ways?
It is a big increase in students, but I wouldn't count on all of them eating. So one of the benefits that you get when you go to universal meals is that when you take that qualification factor out, when you take money out, it really becomes part of the school culture for everybody to eat. And so that's why you see those participation numbers go way up. And I don't suspect that you would get that same benefit if you had a new category. The other piece that you're missing there is there's a lot of there's a hope of administrative savings in processing those applications, in collecting bills, that sort of thing. And rather than easing all of that burden, you're actually making it worse because you're adding this additional category to keep track of. So again, I can't emphasize enough how difficult that avenue would be, and how I definitely couldn't implement this in the upcoming school year. So if that was something that you wanted to pursue, we would at least need a year phase in to do that.
Yeah. And Faye, did you have something to add to this discussion?
I was just going to say what Rosie had just said, that you may pick up 16,000 students in eligibility, but you will not pick up 16,000 students in terms of eating meals. And I don't think you'd see the levels of participation that you see in universal school meal schools. So that 65% as the base of Brianna's estimate, you wouldn't see that increase in participation because the culture won't shift in the classroom, and families will still be required to fill out applications in order to get there. And it will take many years too. And just, in addition to the work for AOE to implement, to really have families embody the message that they are now eligible for meals and who weren't before, but still have to fill out an application. There's a lot of families who are eligible now don't fill out the application because they assume they aren't eligible, because there are always people who are worse off, and and people compare themselves to their neighbors and all of that. And so getting that to all of the family, getting that message really embodied in a school, that families should fill out the application and are eligible for free meals, will take some time.
Rosie, tell us, how do their schools get families to sign up for IEPs and things like that? If it's so difficult for a school to achieve this, we seem to have no shortage of students that are in special programs and have IEPs and they're in all these other social programs, but yet we can't get them to fill out their hot lunch paper.
Well, that's really outside my wheelhouse. I'm state director of child nutrition, but I don't do anything with any of those other programs. I did, though, want to spend a few minutes talking, Senator Starr, you were kind of expressing frustration that there weren't other good options. And I wanted to present to you some other options that you could think about. Interestingly, with a similar amount of money to what Brianna just mentioned. So one option that we talked about yesterday is for you to do universal breakfast. And I actually really like this option because it gets you a lot of the advantages of universal meals without some of the issues that we've talked about with data. So with universal breakfast, you still are collecting the applications for households for lunch. So you get that free and reduced poverty data that you need, that the agency was really worried about. But you pay for everybody's breakfast. So breakfast is a cheaper meal. So the amount that the state would pay is significantly less per meal. But you get a lot of the benefits of attendance. So we find that when you, and I don't have the studies off the top of my head, although Faye might, but when you implement universal meals, kids show up on time for school because they want to get the breakfast. And possibly it might also be because families aren't running around trying to provide breakfast at home. So you get some of those attendance benefits. You at least are providing children with one solid meal per day that they can count on. You're kind of making more of a community feeling around that meal. So I loved the description yesterday of parents or of teachers in Winooski sitting together with the children around breakfast as kind of a check-in opportunity. You get all of those benefits, but it's significantly cheaper. And I was estimating somewhere between 8 and 14 million. I expect it would come down on the lower side of that. Generally, I would expect, again, I don't have data to back this up, that the households who would take advantage of that would probably be more of the lower income households. So you'd probably be meeting the needs of that group that you're looking to target. The more affluent families probably are still going to feed their children at home, although it will be really nice for them to know that if, it's a busy morning and they can't get the meal together that day, their kid can eat at school, no big deal. So I think you would still really be, in effect, targeting that middle population that you're thinking about, but without there being that kind of stress about it and that added burden. So that's one option. If you don't feel like you have enough funding and resources to go all out and do both breakfast and lunch, I'd really urge you to think about doing just breakfast. And administratively, that's not particularly complicated for us to do. You don't get the savings of not processing applications at all, and you don't get the savings of not collecting bills, but you do get a lot of these other advantages. The other option that you could think about doing with any amount of money is what I alluded to earlier this morning, where you just increase the state match that the state pays on a per meal basis. That's a chunk of money that the state is currently required to pay out by USDA. And that's, I believe, just included in general fund appropriations, but you could increase that dollar amount. You could do it every year, you could do it one time. And we pay that out based on the number of total meals served between July and December every year. And so that's basically a way of just giving a little bit more money to the schools based on the number of meals that they're serving. You get to decide how much you're going to do. And then I would imagine if you do that, you'll have a number of schools who would like to pursue universal meals, but currently don't feel like they can make that budget leap. They don't have quite the amount of extra funds that they need to do this. And so maybe that additional funding gives them the ability to make that leap and do this themselves, as they currently have the authority to do. Or maybe that additional funding allows them to decide to purchase some local beef, or add an additional entree, or buy a piece of equipment that allows them to serve a higher quality meal. We're not telling them that they have to use it for universal meals, but any additional amount of money is going to increase the quality of the program, and some of them may very well decide to use that. So if you feel like you have any amount of additional money that you want to put towards the programs, I would tell you to do that. And that can be done with basically no administrative costs. We're already making a yearly payment. We just increase the amount of that yearly payment.
Yeah, thank you, Rosie. Chris?
Thank you. Rosie, there are elements of what you just said in the amendment we looked at yesterday. I don't know if you had the chance to look at that Faye and Jim had put together for us to consider. Have you had the chance to look at it, and am I off in thinking that they're related or not?
My understanding was that Faye and Jim were working on something that was just going to move the state per meal payment, or sorry, the per meal payment to the state level, that the state would pay a fixed amount per meal, but that amount would be enough to cover the full cost of the paid meal. So it would be the difference between the federal reimbursement rate for paid meals and the federal reimbursement rate for free meals. Faye, go ahead and jump in if I'm wrong there, but that's what I understood that amendment to be.
Faye?
If you'd like, I can talk a little bit about the amendment. And I know Jim is here too, but the idea behind the amendment is that it shifts some of the cost of universal school meals to the top of the education fund and out of school budgets. It doesn't necessarily cover the full cost. So when we talk about, one thing I think that's helpful to understand is that when we talk about the full cost of a meal or the federal government's reimbursement for a free meal, that is just the name for the maximum reimbursement that the federal government will give for a meal, is the free meal rate. It doesn't necessarily cover the full cost of making that meal. So the term full cost is used, but it doesn't actually necessarily cover the full cost, which is why, we have schools that are operating school meal programs and aren't necessarily making their ends meet within their school meal budget through just the federal reimbursements and other sources of funding. So what the proposal does is it takes as Rosie said, the federal government pays a per meal reimbursement for each meal served, and it's a different amount if it's a free meal or paid meal or a reduced price meal. This would make up the difference between the paid meal and the free meal. So essentially the school would receive a reimbursement for meals that qualify as paid meals, that between the state and the federal government, that would be the equivalent of the federal government reimbursement for a free meal. And so that helps cover some of the increased cost. That's the cost that's lost when families are no longer paying for the meal. It mirrors what the state currently does for the reduced price meal program, where they're paying what the family would have paid. The other aspect of the way that this amendment works is that it requires schools school meal programs still have to create a budget and try to stay within the budget. And if they go over their budget, it's borne in their school budget. So there's a cost containment and a responsibility on behalf of each school and school meal program to have a responsible school meal budget. This just creates an additional source of revenue for the school meal program. It doesn't necessarily mean that the school meal program's full costs are covered. And so there's a share there, potentially for schools between the school budget and what would come off of the top of the education fund to help pay for the school meals. And then with this, it's within the idea of schools moving to universal school meals. So you get rid of, you hear what Scott Fay was sharing yesterday about being able to focus on, on really trying to maximize the number of students who are eating a meal, because this draws down that money, and they focus on serving them the nutritious meals as opposed to trying to make their school budget work and their school meal program work by selling more bagels and a la carte items and things that are less nutritious to kids who can afford that. So that's just a little bit about it. And I don't know if it makes sense for Jim to do a formal walkthrough of it beyond that. But that was the intent behind it, was to create something that helps support the increased cost for schools, but doesn't take the responsibility fully off of schools in terms of creating their school meal program budget.
Yeah, thank you, Faye. Chris?
Hey, I hear you're saying there's a cost containment element which reduces costs, but is there a reason to think that this reduces the budget, or does it shift the budget from potentially the ed fund to the general fund? Or help me understand the implications, the broader implications.
So essentially it would shift the fiscal note from being covered in school budgets to being covered off the top of the education fund. And it would impact the schools who are already providing universal school meals as well. So schools positively for their school meal program budget. And we did some calculations yesterday. And for the schools that are already providing universal school meals, we think it would be about 2.9 million a year that they're currently investing in covering for the paid category meals through their school budgets. That would shift. And that goes for, what you heard yesterday from Sean McMahon at Winooski, that they have a very small percentage of students who they're covering that paid amount for, and then it kind of increases from there as for schools. I do think, that I'll just stop there.
So did you end up with a number with this amendment, what kind of an end number do we end up with costing?
Yeah, and I don't know if Brianna has had a chance to look at this from her perspective. So when we looked at Hunger Free Vermont's calculations, it did drop, for the increased cost, not the cost currently being covered for the schools already providing universal school meals, but the increased cost, it did drop at our fiscal calculations by about $1 million because the breakfast reimbursement is a little bit lower than what families are charged for breakfast. But the federal reimbursements on average a little bit lower than that. So it does drop that a bit and may have an impact on kind of the higher end of the fiscal note. But I'm not sure if Brianna has had a chance to look at that yet.
Yeah, Brianna?
I will say that I did take a look at what the total cost of the meal program would be, just looking at the way it currently is. And we can see that on the high end, if all of the students were to participate at all of the schools, we are in alignment with what the Agency of Education had put out at about the $50 million on that high end, looking at the statewide costs. I haven't seen the nuance of the language in this particular amendment. So if you want, I'm happy to read through that and see if we think there would be a reduction based on the particular language that you guys have used. But that's what I would say for the total statewide costs as of now.
So that, I mean, we did have a 24 to 50 now with these changes that we just talked about, that's with everyone in, but if the numbers drop to the 70 or 80%, it would be less than the 50 million, right?
Yes, that is true. And I think I have, let me pull up my reference here. If we were to take that same percentage of the 60% and the 75% for the statewide public schools, looking at about $30 million with that participation rate, and maintaining the free and reduced eligibility that we've seen historically. So that can give you a sense of, it's a pretty significant range.
Yeah. Rosie, you gave us some numbers. If we were gonna do, how much money, you said we send schools money on lunches served between July and December or something? And how much do we send schools from the state in that group?
I don't have the number at my fingertips, but I think it's about $500,000. So you could significantly increase that without coming close to the amount of money that you're talking about for universal meals. I did also want to say that to your question about whether it costs more coming off the top of the education fund or at the local budgets, in all of those calculations, I think everybody was using the free reimbursement rate as the true cost of the meal. So I don't think that there's a huge variation there other than implementation. So if it comes off the top of the education fund or from the general fund, I would expect almost everybody to implement the first year, versus if you're putting it on local school budgets, I would expect that they wouldn't implement in the first year, and it might take until the later years for them to implement. So I suspect that that's really the only variation that you'd see in cost, is when does the cost actually hit, but not really in the total costs.
It's a great point, Rosie.
Well, I don't know where we're going with this, but it certainly, I think we have a lot more questions than we do answers. Yeah, the idea of sending schools money on the meals that they serve in between there, if it's all we're sending them is $500,000, it's not a whole lot of money per school or per district, I wouldn't think, if you broke that down. So committee, where do you want to go from here?
Well, I'd like to know whether or not we have the votes. And if we have to, I'd like to retreat to local incentives for food. That's where we started. And we've seemed to have totally lost track of that piece, which is much more relevant to our issue. But I think we've come a long way. I think schools are in a universal meal situation, but potentially have the next year coming as well. And shame on us if we don't use the swirl of money and changes in the funding formula and everything to land in a place where we're feeding our kids.
Yeah. Should we run through that amendment that Rihanna was talking about and Jim put together with Jim? We tied him up here for an hour. Should we run through that amendment and see how it all plays out with where we want to go?
Sure.
So Jim, you want to run through the amendment for us, and I don't know if you want to have Linda put that on the screen, or if you can, or
I can do it. Let me just find it here. See, that's one. I think it's this one here. Okay. Okay, so for the record, Jim Dameray, Ledge Council, we're walking through a draft floor amendment. This bill now is, of course, on the floor. So this would be a floor amendment by one or more senators. It does two things. It amends the section of statute on award of grants to add a new provision here. So C1 is the existing law, which is the grant of funds to make up the state share of free and reduced price lunches. That's existing law, not changing. The new provision here is 2A. I'll just read through it. It says from state funds appropriated to the agency for this subdivision, the agency shall reimburse each school district that made available breakfast and lunch to students at no charge under this subdivision, which is the subdivision in the bill that requires universal school meals. So if they're offering universal school meals, the state will reimburse each school district for the cost of each meal actually provided in the district during the previous quarter that qualifies as a paid breakfast under the federal school breakfast program, or as a paid lunch under the federal school lunch program. And the reimbursement amount will be a sum equal to the federal reimbursement rate for a free school breakfast or lunch, less the federal reimbursement rate for a paid school breakfast or lunch, using rates identified annually by the AOE from payment levels established annually by the USDA. These rates shall include performance-based cash reimbursement as determined by the USDA. And then it says, notwithstanding the education fund limitations on use of funds, reimbursement amounts paid above that we talked about should be paid from the education fund and should be added to the adjusted education payments received quarterly. So it's a quarterly reimbursement there. And then the second instance of amendment strikes out in the underlying bill subdivision A1C, which is the part that says that universal school meals will be paid for by school districts. So that's being struck out. This is an amendment to the, I should have said this at first, is to the Committee on Appropriations report. So that report obviously already strikes out all of that language about farm to school. The other thing I'll say is what this amendment does not do two things. It does not strike out the in the Senate Appropriations amendment in your bill. There is an exemption from excess spending by school districts for the cost of school meals. This amendment does not strike that exemption, so that exemption still would be here. I left it because there's still some, to Faye's point, so some costs borne by school districts, and there's still a requirement that they offer universal meal. So if the grant funding wasn't available one year, they would incur the cost. So I've left the excess spending exemption in. And then having done is put in an appropriation amount in this, because I have no idea what it would be, and I'm assuming that Senate Appropriations would want to deal with that part of it. So with that said, I'll just stop there.
Yeah. So this is, Chris, you worked with Faye and Jim putting this part together, or was that me?
I wouldn't say this has my seal of approval, but we had asked them for alternatives, and this is, I think, the scheme that folks have come up with to quote unquote take it off the top of the ed fund and still get us to our goal. That's the mechanics of how they've done it.
Brian?
Thanks, Bobby. And so if I'm reading this, doesn't this just take general fund money and move it to the ed fund?
Yeah. Well, it comes off the top of the ed fund, right, Jim?
It does. It does. So that ed fund, of course, has various revenue streams. So general fund, sales taxes, of course, various streams there. So, but it would come off the top of that fund.
Okay. My other question, and again, maybe I just don't understand a lot of the education stuff. On page 2, line 5, the rates shall include performance-based cash reimbursement. I don't know what that means.
I think that's a question for Faye or for Rosie.
Rosie's got her hand up.
So that is to the federal government has a couple of different reimbursement rates that they give out. So they give schools an extra, currently 7 cents, but that amount changes per meal served. And so that language is just to ensure that the state amount would include the value of that federal little piece of money, so that we're not shortchanging the schools and leaving that out. So yes, it sounds very technical, but it's a label for some federal funds that the schools get for those meals. And it's to specify that the amount you pay them for a paid meal would include that value.
Okay, and then the other question I had, I guess for Jim, if the excess spending provision is, I think you said it's still in the amendment, or you didn't delete it.
Correct.
That would still put the burden of any leftover costs after the taxes are taken out from the sales tax and the lottery and all that. The school districts would still be responsible for that other money. Would that not be true?
Yeah, so they would, as Faye was testifying, this provision would not insulate schools entirely from having to bear food program costs. And if this is a grant funding program, of course, and if the grant funds were appropriated one year to cover these meals, the school districts would still have to provide them. So for both of those reasons, this language keeps in the exemption from excess spending the cost of providing school meals.
So if I'm following you, if a school went over and was gonna fall into excessive spending into that black hole with the meals program, they would be exempt from falling in that penalty box of excessive spending.
Correct. If that's what caused them to fall into that box, then that would not happen because those costs would not be counted toward excess spending.
Yeah. And have any of the committee members thought at all about Rosie's one of her options of moving forward with just the breakfast program? Have you given that option any thought?
I guess I'd like to understand if it's really solving our problems. I mean, it's still a big chunk of money, and you know, it only gets us part of the way there. So it still keeps the cash register in at lunch.
Yeah.
But you know, it's only $10 million, but I don't feel like that's really going to relieve the tension that we're feeling from folks at this moment, but I could be wrong.
I agree.
I'm of the mindset it's better to get something than nothing. If we don't think we can get the other piece through, let's at least try to take a step forward this year.
I mean, I guess I'd like to ask the committee. I mean, we all voted for this. It wasn't free. So what's really changed? Like, did we think the money was going to materialize on the school board steps? Like that I'm not really understanding. I get that we maybe have a floor vote problem, maybe, but why is this surprising to this group? It's the same exact thing that we designed.
Well, it isn't surprising, to me. I expected that we would have some serious questions in appropriations, and but I figured with all these federal dollars that we have floating around, that we could, break that out over a 5-year period. And we have 3 strong years of money from the feds that we can use over a 3-year period. And by then the economy would be straightened out enough so that it could pick up and move forward. I don't know, maybe we should have put some type of a review process in the bill so that it got reviewed after 3 years, and almost like a sunset, and we could have hashed it over at the end of the federal money time and moved from there. But we may not be on the committee in that at that junction, and I don't know, but I didn't expect it to roll through approach, wide open. And I think with some modifications, I would hope that we could still push it through with, it'd be a tight vote, but those guys, you hear Mazza every morning or afternoon when we meet. Well, Star just wants to feed the rich kids.
I don't.
That isn't going to go away. And if we had Jane on our side to promote this wholeheartedly, that would ease a lot of concerns from some of our other colleagues, I think. Chris?
Well, unfortunately, people don't realize, frankly, how few rich kids there are, and it's really a scale problem, frankly, because many of us happen to be comfortably off. But Jim, I'm curious, do you see us as having, there's a pretty good chance the feds are going to extend universal meals next year. And I wonder about if that doesn't happen, do we have the power to mandate that schools use a tiny fraction of the millions of dollars they're getting from the feds towards this end?
My understanding is no. And the answer no is not out of language from the ESSER relief packages. There seems to be some ability there that suggests you could, but according to Rosie, who can talk about this in more depth than I can, there are other provisions within the federal agricultural rules around CEP and Provision 2 that prohibits basically the use of those federal funds for this purpose.
So there is some specific language in the universal meals provisions at the federal level about the cost differential that says that the cost differential needs to be made up with non-federal funds. And so I have flagged that for USDA as a, if they wanted to allow states some flexibility, that might be something where they could they could look at changing that and have it be non-USDA funds. But I don't know if that will have any impact. So as it stands right now, you couldn't use these funds specifically to pay for universal meals. Potentially, you could use the funds for, equipment, staffing, stuff like that, but you couldn't use it specifically to pay for the cost of meals.
Plus, yeah, if the school districts, I think we talked about this yesterday, we can't tell them either how to spend their money, but if they were wise, they would do the same thing that we've been doing last year and then again now. You use the federal money to cover expenses that you're using general funds to pay for that are legitimate, and you extract your general funds and put it back in your budget and use that to cover things that the feds won't allow the federal money to be used for. But I don't know, that would have to be done at the superintendent's level, a principal's level, or even at the school board level. I would hope that they would be clever enough to do just that. But I'm sure you're going to see a lot of bricks and mortar being put up with their money. They love to build onto their schoolhouses, and the sad part of all that is the building doesn't educate the children. It's the teachers up front that that educate children. And we've got well, I don't want to get started on our quality of education, but I would like to bump up the nutrition of our students and help that out.
They had a question.
Faye?
I just wanted to add, one of the things that has been taken out of S100 was the appropriation of a one-time grant out of the general fund to help schools make the transition. That's not in there anymore, but that's a source of, that's something that schools could use their federal dollars for. So if, as Rosie said, if they need to staff up or bring on some administrative support or make investments in equipment or other areas of their cafeteria or their kitchen, they can use the federal dollars for that, or American Rescue Plan Act funding could probably be used for that too. So I think to your point, Senator Starr, we're still, we're all still trying to figure out exactly what all the federal federal funding options are and what kinds of federal funding options will shift. That's part of the reason that the 5-year rollout for this bill is really nice, because it allows for that flexibility. If the waivers are extended for another year, schools will use those waivers for another year, and the cost of going to universal school meals will be held off for a year. So there's, moving the bill forward now helps us keep ourselves in Vermont on a path toward permanent universal school meals and not having to go back. And there's still buffer time in there for some of these things that are uncertain right now to shake out, and for us to see how we can move forward in a way that does work really well. So I just wanted to remind us of that runway time.
Anthony?
I just want to back up to what Chris was saying a little while ago, and sort of a question. I mean, this bill has passed 3 committees, if I remember correctly. Ag, education, and appropriations, the way it is. Do we think we've lost votes since then? Because we've been sort of grappling with this like every day, all day. But has the rest of the Senate been grappling with this, or have we lost votes because of the letters from the superintendents or whatnot? I'm just not sure what situation we're in right now, to be perfectly honest. The other thing I would say is that I don't think, when push comes to shove, I'm not so sure that going with breakfast program to begin with has to be seen as a setback. If we're talking about 5-year implementation anyway, we can implement breakfast now or this year, whatever, with a goal in the bill of saying we're going to implement lunch within 5 years. And we have to figure out more how to phrase it and where the money would come from. But I don't think going to breakfast first is any different or any worse than going to a couple of schools first and then expanding it to more schools, universally, as opposed to just saying we're going to go breakfast this year and the goal is within 5 years to go to lunch, and we're going to figure out how to pay for it, or we're just going to come out of the budgets.
Well, it would certainly, if we do go that route, or if we do that, it cuts the expenditure basically in half, from doing, or less than half. But if it's, I think Rosie said it would be somewhere between 8 and 14 million. Well, that's a lot better. I think it would sit a lot better than the 20 odd million to 40 million. And it would, if it's set up good, if the bill, if the new language was written properly to do like Anthony just suggested, or similar to that, because we need to get our local food stuff back in that bill. And I mean, the House could possibly add that back in, but, or if they change the bill and we had something in there and we got to a committee or conference, we could load it back in. But it would be nice if it went to the Senate with a strong vote it went to the House with a strong vote out of the Senate, which I think if we scaled it back, we could get, but we ought to have that local foods issue back in that bill, I think.
And I don't want to push towards going to breakfast first if people are going to see that as a defeat. I mean, I'm willing to go with the whole thing as we passed it before. I don't mean to be this a major capitulation. I mean, I think I just want to discuss ways around it.
Well, we do have a caucus coming up, I think maybe tonight, and I'm sure that'll be a topic of discussion. We could see what we've got for support, but I think I think we ought to have a B plan ready to rock and roll if, you know, if that doesn't go well. Brian?
Yeah, thank you, Bobby. So to answer Senator Polina's question, I think we have lost some votes. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And I had a question for Rosie. Section 7 had a position, a full-time classified position created. If we did, and I say if we did only the breakfast, are you still going to need that position? And then down the road, if we eventually add lunch, are you going to be looking for another position?
It would, I would only need one position for both meals. And breakfast kind of allows a bit more of a phase in. I'm just trying to think about about whether we could do. It's definitely going to be more work for my staff, and I'm hesitant to say that we wouldn't need a position for breakfast only. I do think there's enough additional work around checking the applications, but I certainly would not be asking for two positions. It would. That one position for breakfast would then allow us to do lunch as well.
Okay, so I guess we'll live with maybe.
Brian, have you talked with your crew, your caucus at all to see where they are?
Yeah, but it's been a while. We haven't, because everybody knew that this was coming up tomorrow. So I think they wanted to know exactly what was going to be in it before we got a commitment one way or the other. I think the way it left here, we would have had problems with some of the folks there. I mean, Senator Parent can speak up if he wants because he was in the same meetings that I was. You've got Senator Benning, whose wife is a teacher, who may have a little bit different opinion than the others. But I did hear from at least two of the other senators that, you know, this is going to impact potentially property taxes, and they just don't want to have anything to do with that.
Yeah.
Am I off?
Corey, have you talked with any of your crew?
I mean, their ultimate concern is property taxes, and where the administration is on it. The administration hasn't come out in support of this effectively. So I think there's a few people just concerned about that, but I think you'd probably get about half of us.
Yeah. Well, we'd have to do better than half, and you had half. I think we're going to come up one or two short. I think we do better than half though, but it might cause some hard feelings, and if you can do something that the bulk of the people can support, even if you don't, if you don't hit a home run, at least if you get the second base, there's possibilities of scoring. Sometimes you're better off not to try for a whole loaf, and I didn't think we were right from the beginning looking for a whole loaf, but giving schools like 5 years to get this up and going. But it certainly, I think we ought to, I don't know, I think we ought to try to do the breakfast program and get the local foods part back in the draft, and see if we can get that down to approach to see if they would look that expenditure over, and if we could get a favorable vote out of there on that and move forward. Chris?
Well, it was a Probst that took out the local foods piece. but I'd always understood that to be basically because the language wasn't as important as the money. But, you know, I think it is really important that this, what was the biggest estimate on that was $5 million, like at its maturity, 3 million something. We're going to spend 300 million on economic development in the next several months. And we spent, you know, 900 million or close to that last year on quote unquote economic development. So I hope when you're having the discussion in Senator Probst that it's in this context. I actually am more and more convinced that there's no single better strategy for rural economic development than we've come up with. Some of you were supportive of this idea of paying people to move here. I've always been uncomfortable with that. That was $15 million, I think. So, you know, I just wanted in the context of a lot of money, the same way I think of the school meals. We're not into that yet. We're not into figuring out how to prioritize those dollars. But we have in the course of this conversation moved away from the value of food security, feeding our kids, you know, some of the core values that to me need to stay a priority. I'll work with everybody on a path that gets us moving forward again. But there are big numbers floating around, and we can't pretend this is not in that context.
No, it certainly is rural economic development if we can, you know, get the small producers rolling and going, and we've heard from quite a few that last summer was a good summer and they did well, but we also heard that stores were running out of food, and that's why our local guys could sell their produce and products, and I'm sure the quality was a heck of a lot better from our local growers. I guess we haven't come to any conclusion yet of where the committee wants to go. If you want to, you know, do the whole loaf or do the breakfast thing and move that forward. I don't know. If any of you thought enough about that to make a decision. Brian?
Yeah, I don't think I want to do the whole loaf, as you put it. You have a caucus today, you said?
Well, it's not until tonight.
Okay. I guess I just suggest it might be a good idea to sound people out then to see whether, even if just the breakfast loaf was going to be palatable. I mean, if we can put together anything we want, but if you find out at the caucus after we put something together that just includes the breakfast, that there's no appetite for it, we're still in the same position we are now.
I can't believe they wouldn't support doing just the breakfast. You know, that. I mean,
and
We're
I'll
not
do
on
the
the
same thing
floor.
with my side, and I'm going to use $10 million as the cost. We have a caucus on Friday.
So that is basically 2 million a year, you know, depending on the numbers, it could get up to 10. But it goes from, you know, from what we'd had down to 2. And hell, we throw away more than $2 million every day on some program that we're going to melt the beans. But anyways,
I'll just remind the floor is tomorrow afternoon. So we, in fact, have tomorrow morning if we wanted to to come up with language or whatever.
And we can move it a day, I guess. I mean,
Yeah.
we were gonna hear
Yeah,
from the health department anyway, right?
Yeah, we're going to have them in the morning, and Becca, our leadership is behind us, wanting to do what's right and what we can get done. And Becca's gung ho on making sure that these small growers are included in the bill. So, I think that will help to some degree.
I
So,
wonder, is there any specific economic development money that is set for rural communities or agriculture? I mean, I think that's a strong argument that, the program is about local agriculture and supporting rural economic development. I just don't know whether there's any particular programs or pots of money in economic development agency that could be easily identified as being appropriate towards this.
we haven't talked about doing like last year. Michael did a bunch in his committee. We did some in our committee. Health and Welfare did some in their committee. But we haven't had, of course, that, I don't know if all that money's been, somebody said isn't even going to get straightened around and sent out for a while yet.
Right.
I don't know. Have you guys talked about that in finance at all, Chris?
No, I mean, not other than we expect clarity in May, right, of the reg.
Yeah, it's late.
I mean, but we're talking like, what is it, $900 million? I mean, this is what I keep coming back to.
It's $1 billion, 2 or 3 altogether, but the towns and the schools are getting a hunk of it. But still, there's $900 million.
You got $1,000 in your pocket. We just want 25.
It'll disappear if we don't scrap for our share of it, I'll tell you. So maybe we ought to talk with Jim and try to figure out some language that he could work on, between now and tomorrow morning. Is that agreeable with the committee?
Yep.
Yeah, it depends what it says, but yes.
What? Yeah.
Well, I'm sure it'll say what we asked Jim to put in it. He has a draft in front of him that we have on our screen. I think Linda put that on. Because I don't think we'd have 2 to 3 hours tomorrow morning to put something together. If you just want to talk about the pieces and then craft it up in the morning. Faye?
Faye has her hand up.
I'd be happy to, if the committee would like, I'd be happy to work with Jim on that as well.
Yeah. And I don't know if we have any other numbers for Brianna to work on. We've got what she gave us earlier this morning on the different programs. We have Rosie's numbers that she gave us on a couple of different options to work with. Your numbers are pretty solid, Rosie, you think?
I actually would love to hear Brianna's take on breakfast only because I didn't take into consideration that lower participation rate. So she may end up actually coming with a lower number than I gave you.
Yeah.
So,
Did,
which I'm sure you would like to see. So,
well, it would be easier to sell. Do you have those numbers, Brianna?
Yes, I do have a model that's up and running. It will just take me a few minutes really to pull it together. So I'm happy to run those numbers and provide you with a written document today.
Yeah. So when will you come back? When could you come back with those, Brianna?
I would say I could probably do it by about 1 o'clock this afternoon.
Yeah, we'll be in different committees by then. I guess if we had those for the first thing in the morning, would be our best time. Because we have different committees in the afternoon, and then we have a caucus this evening and a host of other meetings, and I don't think we'd be able to do it unless, the only other way is if you could do it so we could come back late this morning, but I don't want to crowd you too hard.
I think I could come up with the numbers fairly quickly. When is the latest you guys would be able to do this? Just to give me a sense of your timeline.
Well, we're here until noon. I don't know, 11:30, 11:45.
Sure. I think I can do that. I'll just push everything else and I'll do this right now. So that will be fine.
Well, we appreciate that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Why don't we take a 10-minute break or come back at 11:15? And we have Julie Moore's suggested changes to our innovation board makeup. Remember, we had Julie on and asked her to come back with some suggestive changes, so we could, when we come back, we could talk about those changes that she's proposed, and then at 11:30 or 11:45, whenever Brianna comes back, we'll switch back onto the schools program. So Jim?
Do you want, I'm hearing some direction in terms of an alternative draft, which I can go over with you briefly, but do you want me to start working on a different draft?
Well, I don't know yet. We'll have to see the numbers that Brianna comes back with, but we know that they're going to be where the ballpark they're going to be in on a breakfast program, and put the the buy local, the food stuff back in that draft.
Yeah.
And we'll plug numbers in and talk about that when we come back at 11:30 or 11:45.
Okay, I guess so. Okay, yep.
But Faye can help you with some of that. And I don't know if you need something from Rosie or not. Are you going to be available if we need to talk with you, Rosie?
yeah, I have a USDA meeting, but I can duck out of that. So if Linda can just email me when you're ready, I can pop back in.
Yeah, good. So we'll take 10 minutes and we'll come back at quarter of 11. So very good. Thanks everybody we've been shoveling like heck, but the pile hasn't gotten very big. But we'll get there.